Luke 19:10, Jesus says that the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. And I grew up lost. I grew up without my father, to a single parent, grew up in poverty, experienced being on welfare. Food came from food stamps, housing came from public housing. Not having my father in my life really left me on a path of wondering, not really having direction, guidance, purpose. So as I'm growing up without these things, I really don't know where to find them. And I have this understanding, this innate understanding that I'm supposed to provide, protect in some way. Even though I'm not a father, I'm just a child. I was the oldest and I was the male. And so I had that innate responsibility in my mind. And at 16, we had a fire at my house. It was one of the worst things that could have happened because the house that we were living in, we lived with my mom and my brothers. We lived with my grandmother in a house that was inherited and passed down. So we owned this house, at least my grandmother did. And, but we were living paycheck to paycheck. And so, like I said, worst thing that could have happened in that situation happened. We didn't have insurance. We had a fire. And so I was sitting on the yard in the front. It was one night as the firefighters were coming in, and I was sitting off alone to myself over to the side. This just feeling of helplessness. I knew that at that point, my family was homeless. I didn't know what we were going to do. And I felt like, even though, like I said, I was just a 16-year-old kid, I really wasn't going out and working and providing for my family. But I felt like things were out of my control at that point. I felt like I had things in control for some reason up until that point. And at that point, I felt like I lost all that. But in this moment, it was the first time that I can recall really calling out to God with an intense prayer. I mean, and people do this. People do this in moments of desperation. They call out to God to get them out of the moment, get out of the situation that they're in. And once they get back stable or in a better place that they feel that they're in, then they may not call on God again. But in that moment, I prayed if He would help, that I would turn towards Him and I would start following Him, because up until that point, like I said, no direction, no guidance, really. I wasn't not forced, but I wasn't encouraged or pushed towards being in church or anything like that, seeking after the Lord. It was just kind of up to me. And so I called out to God, and I just if you would get us out of this situation, you would provide a way, make a way. We're homeless right now. If you would make a way for my family, I will follow you. And not long after that, we got connected to what was called the Hospitality Network, which was a network of churches that provided shelter for families that would suddenly lose their house and be homeless. And so my family got involved with that. Also, a church came alongside and kind of helped with food and clothing and things like that, the transportation to try to get my family back stable. And I assessed that as a direct answer to my prayer. I saw that God was sending His people in a time of crisis, and I knew that God was answering that prayer. And so that was my first real deep encounter, really knowing that God was real, that He really heard my prayers. And so that set me on a journey. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit. God had provided a way for me to go to college, get education. And I, by His grace, saw that the patterns of the lifestyle that I grew up in that my mom engaged in, that my dad did when he wasn't there, that led to brokenness, and that I needed to break that and follow God's way. And so I got married, trying to be faithful to God and do things His way. And along the way, He sent a pastor. Now, I didn't know how to be a husband. I had never seen it. I knew I was supposed to do it, but I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to lead a wife. I didn't know how to just how to be a godly husband, and eventually, hopefully, to be a godly father. And I didn't know any of that. And so I couldn't call my earthly father and to ask him. He wasn't there. I didn't have a relationship with him. And so God sent a pastor who stepped in that place. Along the way, even before that point, God showed me that He was my father, and He protected and provided for me. But there were certain things that I would engage or encounter in my marriage that I couldn't open the Bible and find the direction on what was next to do. And so I had to pick up the phone and call my pastor, and his availability, not just to be there to preach sermons, which I was growing from, but his availability to really disciple me and just how to be a husband was such a measure of grace that I needed, that showed me that the Father sent the Son to seek and save the lost, because I was lost. And one of the things that He would pour into me was vision. Cast a vision for your family, lead your wife, know where you're going by God's Spirit. And that's something that that God did through this relationship with a pastor. And He really just showed me that He is a Father who is faithful to provide, who's faithful to seek and save the lost. And my whole time growing up, I wanted to move as far away. Grew up in Fairfield, west side of Birmingham, poor. I wanted to move as far away from Fairfield as I possibly could, to have this better life that I thought I could have for my family, to break this cycle. But God, in His grace, through this pastor, through this church, showed me that He was leading me back to where I came from. Not to run from it, but to go back to show people that there is a better way, that God has a blueprint for life that can break these broken cycles. And that's just a measure of grace that obviously none of us can ever repay. And I definitely can't ever repay God for His grace in my life.